The calm before the storm. The Marston County Courthouse stood tall under the warm glow of the morning sun. Its imposing presence had been a silent witness to countless trials over the years, but today felt different. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a sense of anticipation that clung to the walls of the grand building. Reporters lined the hallway, snapping pictures and jotting down notes as they prepared for what they expected to be just another ordinary case, one that would be forgotten as quickly as it was reported. But something about today was off. Even the most seasoned journalists, who had witnessed their fair share of courtroom drama, couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to witness a moment that would change everything. At the heart of this quiet storm was Elise Morgan. A poised and elegant black woman in her early 40s, Elise walked with the kind of confidence that was both mesmerizing and slightly intimidating to those who couldn't quite place it. Clad in a tailored navy blue suit, she exuded an air of authority that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the courthouse lobby. As she moved through the bustling halls, heads turned. Some were curious, others skeptical, but all were drawn to her. They couldn't know it yet, but Elise's calm demeanor masked a storm of determination, and the truth was more powerful than anyone could imagine. Beside her, Gregory Holfs, her seasoned defense attorney, adjusted his glasses with a careful grace, his eyes scanning the room. He was no stranger to high-profile cases, but even he could sense the undercurrent of animosity that seemed to follow Elise wherever she went. Despite his calm exterior, Gregory's heart raced slightly. Today was not going to be just another day in court. The stakes were too high. As Elise stepped forward, her entourage was minimal. She had no flashy cars or entourages of assistants, no media frenzy around her. Instead, it was just Gregory by her side and a single aide, Tiana, who quietly observed the surrounding environment, making sure nothing was out of place. Elise had no need for the spotlight. She was used to the shadows, to working behind the scenes, to being the person no one truly saw, until it was too late. The courtroom was now full. The jury had taken their seats, and the public gallery was filled with spectators eager to see how the day's events would unfold. Even the bailiffs, usually unbothered by the drama of the courtroom, seemed a little more alert. Word had spread that something extraordinary was about to happen. At the prosecution table sat two officers from the Westbridge Police Department, Mark Ridley and Dave Thompson. Ridley, a bulky man in his early 50s, had a reputation for his smirk, a self-assured grin that made it clear he thought this case was already won. His broad shoulders and thick neck gave him an intimidating presence, but his arrogance was what truly set him apart. Thompson, younger and seemingly more intense, sat beside him, his eyes constantly darting around the room as though he were scanning for weaknesses. They exchanged glances, whispering under their breath, convinced this would be an easy win. "Shouldn't take long," Thompson murmured. "She's out of her league." Ridley grunted in agreement, folding his arms across his chest. "She'll crack. They always do. No one challenges us and wins." Their words were spoken in hushed tones, but they were loud enough to cut through the tense atmosphere. The mocking exchange went unnoticed by most, but Elise, ever the perceptive one, caught the quiet arrogance in their words. She could feel the weight of their prejudice and knew what was coming. They thought she was just another woman who would shrink under their authority, another victim of the system who had dared to stand in their way. But Elise Morgan was no ordinary woman, and today she was about to show them why. The judge, Pamela Whitfield, presided over the case with an air of quiet authority. Her thin-framed glasses perched low on her nose as she sorted through the papers in front of her, the stacks of evidence neatly arranged on her desk. She seemed calm, but her posture was slightly rigid, as though she could sense the tension in the room. Whitfield had seen her fair share of courtroom drama, but she knew this case would be unlike anything she had handled before. The charges against Elise were straightforward, or so it seemed. Allegedly, she had interfered with a police operation that had taken place a few weeks prior. Ridley and Thompson had claimed that Elise obstructed their investigation, but the details were vague. There were no clear answers, only the suggestion that Elise had crossed the line. Still, as the trial began, it was evident that the story was far from simple. Elise knew it, and so did the handful of people who were truly paying attention. As the court session began, the hush grew deeper. The prosecutor, District Attorney Colleen Marshall, stood up to make her opening statement. Her words were crisp, professional, but beneath her polished exterior, there was a slight undercurrent of contempt for Elise. The prosecution's narrative painted Elise as a reckless individual who had tried to stop a legitimate investigation. But the truth, as anyone who had followed the case could see, was far more complicated. Gregory Holtz, the seasoned defense attorney, rose to counter the prosecution's claims. He spoke carefully, his voice steady, promising the jury that they would see things from a different perspective. His words were measured but hinted at the reality behind the scenes, the truth that no one had dared to acknowledge. Elise sat there, unmoving, her face a mask of calm. But beneath her composed exterior, her mind was racing. She knew what people thought of her: a troublemaker, an outsider, someone who didn't belong in the same room as those who held the power. But today, she would show them the truth that power wasn't always what it appeared to be. The trial had only just begun, but already a sense of inevitability lingered in the air. It was clear to Elise that this was no ordinary case, and she was no ordinary defendant. Something far greater was at stake. This trial wasn't just about proving her innocence. It was about exposing the deeper truth, about revealing the patterns of corruption that ran unchecked in the very institutions people were supposed to trust. The reckoning begins. As the court settled into its rhythm, the tension in the room was palpable. Elise sat in her chair, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. But beneath her poised exterior, a storm was brewing. The soft murmurs of the spectators in the gallery faded away as District Attorney Colleen Marshall began to speak, her words flowing with the practiced cadence of someone who had spent years in the courtroom. Marshall was professional, but there was a subtle edge to her voice, a slight condescension that made it clear how little she thought of the woman sitting at the defendant's table. "The facts are clear, Your Honor," Marshall began, addressing the judge. Miss Elise Morgan deliberately interfered with a police investigation, obstructing law enforcement officers who were executing their duties. This was not an isolated incident. This was an intentional disruption, one that endangered the safety of the officers involved and hindered their ability to do their jobs. The prosecution will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Miss Morgan's actions were not only reckless but criminal. Elise's face remained composed as Marshall spoke, but she could feel the weight of the accusation. She had expected nothing less. She had known from the moment the charges were filed that the case against her would be built on a narrative of hostility, that the system would try to paint her as an obstacle, a threat to the established order. But what Marshall and the officers didn't know was that Elise had faced far worse than what they could dish out. The city of Westbridge was about to learn that Elise Morgan wasn't someone you could easily intimidate or silence. The prosecution's opening statement was predictable. Paint Elise as the villain, distort the truth, and make her look like a simple troublemaker who had dared to defy the authority of the police. Ridley and Thompson sat behind Marshall, nodding along in agreement, their smug expressions almost too eager. They were convinced that this trial would be over before it even began. They didn't understand that they were already in over their heads. Gregory Holtz, Elise's defense attorney, rose after Marshall finished her statement. He was a man with a reputation, a sharp mind, and a moral compass that refused to let him back down when it came to the truth. Holtz adjusted his glasses before speaking, his voice slow but deliberate, drawing everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Holtz began, his eyes scanning the room, meeting the gaze of each juror. "For weeks, you've been told a story about Miss Morgan, a woman who has supposedly interfered with the work of the Westbridge Police Department. But today, I am here to tell you that this story is not the truth. It is a carefully crafted narrative, one designed to distract you from the facts, one that seeks to cover up the real story, the one that no one has dared to speak. A ripple of curiosity spread through the room. People leaned in, sensing that Holtz wasn't simply following the traditional path. His words were charged with purpose, with the kind of certainty that made everyone stop and pay attention. "You see," he continued, "the officers who accuse Miss Morgan are not the heroes they claim to be. They are men who have crossed lines, who have abused their power and used intimidation to silence those who dare question them. They have a history of heavy-handed tactics, of actions that went far beyond what the law allows. And Miss Morgan, she wasn't obstructing justice. She was trying to bring the truth to light." Holtz paused, letting his words hang in the air for a moment, allowing the weight of his statement to settle over the room. Ellis could feel the eyes of the jury on her, some skeptical, others curious. This was it, the first step in revealing the truth. But she knew that getting the jury to see things clearly would take more than just words. It would take the courage to expose the hidden injustices that had been allowed to fester in the shadows. Holtz turned slightly to face the jury, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "What you will hear today is not just about an isolated incident. It's about a pattern of behavior. It's about the misuse of power, the exploitation of the very people these officers were sworn to protect." Miss Morgan wasn't an obstruction. She was a witness. She saw what these officers were doing in her neighborhood, and she asked questions that needed to be answered. And for that, they arrested her. The room shifted. The smugness that had once radiated from Ridley and Thompson began to fade, replaced by a subtle unease. For the first time in the trial, they were no longer certain of the outcome. The accusations of misconduct, of unethical behavior, were not things they had expected to hear. This wasn't going to be as easy as they had thought. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Holtz said, leaning forward, his voice intense but calm, "you will see the evidence today. And I ask you to keep an open mind. You will see footage. You will hear testimony. And you will see the truth. But above all, I ask you to remember this. Miss Morgan is not here as a criminal. She is here as someone who has the courage to stand up for what's right, even in the face of overwhelming opposition." As Holtz finished, the courtroom fell into a tense silence. Ellis remained still, her gaze unwavering. She could feel the eyes of the jury on her, some of them looking at her with curiosity, others with skepticism, but none of them truly understanding the magnitude of the moment. The trial had only just begun, and already it was clear that this was no ordinary case. This wasn't just about a confrontation between one woman and two police officers. This was about something deeper, something more systemic, and Elise was ready to expose it all. Gregory Holtz signaled for the lights to be dimmed, and as the room went dark, the overhead screens flickered to life. The grainy black and white footage appeared, showing the events of that fateful afternoon. Ellis watched the screen intently, her face expressionless. The footage was shaky, but it clearly showed the confrontation between her and the officers. The scene unfolded in a quiet residential neighborhood, with Elise returning from a community event. She was dressed casually, but her calm demeanor was evident even in the footage. Ridley and Thompson were seen approaching her, their body language dismissive, even hostile. Elise knew what was coming. She had been prepared for this moment. The footage didn't show her obstructing the officers. It showed her asking questions, trying to understand why they were in her neighborhood. What the video didn't show was the escalating tension, the threats that Ridley and Thompson had made against her, the intimidation they had used to try to shut her down. But Elise had kept her composure. She wasn't going to be intimidated. The video continued to play, and the room fell silent. Elise could feel the weight of the evidence mounting against the officers, and as the footage showed her being pinned against the police cruiser, her hands cuffed behind her back, a chill ran through the courtroom. This was the moment where everything would change. The truth unveiled. The silence in the courtroom was deafening as the footage ended. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, the tension in the air so thick that even the smallest sound would have broken the spell. Elise Morgan sat motionless at the defendant's table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, as though she were still processing what had just been shown. But in truth, she had already seen this footage 100 times in her mind, each frame seared into her memory. What the courtroom saw was only a small piece of a much larger story, a story they were about to hear in full. As the lights flickered back on, the buzz of whispered conversations filled the room. The jury exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of surprise and confusion. This wasn't what they had expected. This wasn't the woman they had been told about. Elise wasn't the reckless criminal they had been led to believe. She was someone far more complex, someone caught in the crosshairs of something much bigger than herself. Gregory Holtz stood up, his face impassive, but his eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. He had made his point. The prosecution's case was built on assumptions, on a narrative they had hoped would go unchallenged. But now, with this footage, the tide was turning. "Let me remind you," Holtz said, his voice clear and steady, "that what you just saw was not a criminal obstruction. It was a woman concerned for her community, trying to understand why her neighbors were being targeted by a heavy-handed police operation. She wasn't obstructing justice, she was seeking it. And yet, instead of answers, she was met with aggression, force, arrest." He paused, letting his words sink in. "These officers," Holtz continued, "didn't just arrest a woman who was asking questions. They arrested a woman who dared to challenge them. And for what? For doing what any concerned citizen would do: question authority when it crosses the line." The gallery shifted uneasily, and Elise could sense the change in the air. The room, once charged with skepticism, was now filled with doubt. Doubt about the officers. Doubt about the narrative they had tried to weave. The truth was being unveiled, layer by layer, and it was beginning to expose the ugliness that had been carefully hidden for too long. Elise's heart pounded in her chest, but her face remained calm. She knew that this moment, this critical moment, was just the beginning. The jury had seen the footage, but they had only scratched the surface. She had so much more to show them, and she was determined to make sure they saw it all. "Now," Holtz said, stepping aside as he motioned for the next piece of evidence, "I'd like to call our first eyewitness to the stand." The room hushed again as an elderly woman, Carmen Williams, made her way to the witness stand. She was a retired schoolteacher, someone who had lived in the Westbridge neighborhood for decades. Carmen's dog had been her only companion during her evening walk that fateful day, but her casual stroll had turned into a front-row seat to the unfolding drama between Elise and the two officers. As Carmen took the stand, Elise couldn't help but glance at her. Carmen was a soft-spoken woman, but her voice carried the weight of truth. She had seen what happened on that day, and she wasn't going to let it go unnoticed. "I was just walking my dog when I saw Miss Morgan talking to the officers," Carmen began, her voice steady but warm. "I remember it clearly. She wasn't being aggressive or confrontational. She was just asking them what was going on. And when the officers started getting rough with her, I could see the concern in her face. She wasn't fighting them. She was just trying to understand." Carmen paused, her eyes briefly meeting Elise's. Elise gave her a small nod of encouragement, grateful for the woman's courage to speak the truth. Carmen continued, "Now, I've lived here long enough to know when something isn't right. And what I saw that day, it wasn't right. Miss Morgan wasn't doing anything wrong. Those officers, though, they were the ones acting out of line." The jury listened intently as Carmen's testimony echoed through the courtroom, her words painting a clear picture of the reality that had unfolded that day. Elise had been a concerned citizen, someone who cared about the community and who wasn't afraid to ask the tough questions. The officers, on the other hand, had been aggressive and dismissive, quick to escalate a situation that never should have reached that point. Carmen's testimony was powerful, and it carried the weight of a woman who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking out. She wasn't just testifying for Elise, she was testifying for everyone who had ever been silenced by the system, everyone who had ever been afraid to stand up and speak the truth. Carmen's bravery was contagious, and it spread through the room like wildfire. As Carmen finished her testimony, the room seemed to breathe again. The narrative the prosecution had built began to crumble, piece by piece. The officers, Ridley and Thompson, were no longer the untouchable figures they had been moments ago. They were now facing the harsh light of scrutiny, and the truth was beginning to shine through. But Elise knew that this was just the beginning. She had one more witness to call, the most important one of all. Elise's mind raced as she prepared to take the stand herself. She had known that the truth would set her free, but it wasn't just her freedom at stake. This was about more than her personal defense. It was about exposing the deep-seated corruption that had plagued the city's police force for years. It was about bringing to light the injustices that had been allowed to fester in the shadows. As she stood up, she could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on her. The officers, who had once mocked her, were now watching with increasing unease. The jury, who had initially been skeptical, were now beginning to see the full picture, and Elise, with her head held high, was ready to make sure they saw everything. She was about to take control of the narrative, and nothing, not the officers, not the judge, not even the courtroom itself, was going to stop her. The final showdown. The courtroom grew still as Elise Morgan stood, her posture unwavering, as she made her way to the witness stand. The air in the room seemed to thicken with every step she took. She had always known this moment would come, when she would have to reveal the truth in front of everyone. Now, as she took her seat and looked out at the jury, the spectators, and the officers who had once mocked her, there was no trace of fear in her eyes. There was only quiet resolve. Elise glanced at Gregory Holtz, her defense attorney, who gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. He had been by her side every step of the way, helping her navigate the complexities of this case. Now, it was her turn to speak. "Miss Morgan," Judge Whitfield's voice cut through the silence. "You may begin your testimony." Elise took a deep breath and looked directly at the jury. Her voice, calm but steady, echoed through the courtroom. "I'm here today not just to defend myself," she began, "but to defend what is right. To defend the very principle that justice should never be one-sided. That truth should not be decided based on power or authority, but on fairness and integrity." She paused, letting her words sink in. The officers sitting across from her, Mark Ridley and Dave Thompson, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Their expressions had gone from smug arrogance to quiet discomfort. Elise could feel the shift in the room. She could feel the pendulum of justice beginning to swing in her favor. "I was born and raised in this community," she continued, her voice unwavering. "I've spent my life working to protect it, to make sure that every person, no matter their background, has the right to live without fear of being mistreated or discriminated against. I was never someone who sought attention. I was never someone who wanted the spotlight. I've worked quietly, behind the scenes, doing the work that needed to be done to make things better. But that all changed when I saw something that I couldn't ignore, something that demanded I take action." Elise's gaze moved to the jury. She could see them, listening intently. Some of them had looked at her with skepticism when she first entered the courtroom. But now, they were leaning forward, absorbing her every word. She had their attention. I saw two officers Ridley and Thompson, use tactics that were not only aggressive but unjust. I asked questions because I wanted to understand why there were so many police cars in my neighborhood. I wanted to know why the people I had known for years were being treated like criminals when they had done nothing wrong. She let the silence stretch for a moment. And when I asked those questions, when I tried to get answers, I was met with aggression, threats, and ultimately arrest. They didn't want to explain. They didn't want to be questioned. And they certainly didn't want anyone standing in the way of their operation, no matter how questionable it was. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't just any person. I wasn't just another citizen they could intimidate. I wasn't someone they could silence with a pair of handcuffs. Elise's voice grew stronger as she spoke, the weight of her words carrying the full force of her truth. What they didn't know, what none of you knew, is that I'm the head of Homeland Security. My role, my responsibility, is to protect this country, to make sure that people's rights are not violated, no matter where they come from or who they are. And when I saw what was happening that day, I couldn't sit back and pretend I didn't know what was going on. I couldn't let them think that they could operate above the law. Not while I'm standing here. The room was silent. The impact of Elise's words was undeniable. The officers, once so confident, now looked visibly rattled. Their mocking expressions had faded, replaced by confusion and realization. They had underestimated her. They had mocked her, thinking she was just another woman they could push around. But now, they understood who they were up against. Gregory Holtz stood and addressed the jury, his voice steady and deliberate. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you've heard today is not just about one woman's fight for justice. This is about the integrity of the system. It's about ensuring that every person, no matter their status or position, is treated fairly. Elise Morgan didn't just fight for herself that day. She fought for every person who has ever been silenced by those in power. She fought for the future of our communities, and she did it because it was the right thing to do. As Holtz finished his statement, the tension in the room remained palpable. The jury was no longer simply considering the charges against Elise. They were considering something much larger. They were considering the integrity of the justice system itself. Elise had opened their eyes, showing them the layers of corruption and prejudice that had gone unnoticed for far too long. Judge Whitfield, who had remained a neutral observer throughout the trial, now looked at Elise with a new understanding. She knew that this trial had shifted the balance of power, not just for Elise, but for everyone who had ever felt the weight of an unjust system pressing down on them. After what felt like an eternity, the jury filed out to deliberate. The courtroom, once filled with tension, now buzzed with anticipation. Elise remained seated at the defense table, her hands folded, her eyes calm. She had done all she could. She had spoken her truth, and now it was in the hands of the jury. An hour later, the jury returned. Judge Whitfield called the room to order, and the gallery fell silent as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Elise Morgan, not guilty on all charges. The words echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. The room erupted into a mixture of gasps, applause, and murmurs. Elise remained calm, her face serene, but inside, her heart raced. She had done it. She had won. But more importantly, the truth had won. Elise stood up, her eyes meeting the jury's, and for the first time in the trial, a small smile played at the corners of her lips. She had not only cleared her name, but she had exposed the rot within the system. And in doing so, she had taken the first step toward making things right. As she walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the case lifted from her shoulders. The reporters crowded around her, microphones thrusting toward her face, but she simply smiled and walked past them. Elise Morgan wasn't interested in the spotlight. She was interested in making a difference. And today, she had done just that. The courtroom door closed behind her, but the reverberations of her victory would echo far beyond these walls. For Elise Morgan, this was just one battle in a much larger war, a war for justice, for equality, and for the truth. And she was just getting started. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.